Okinawa, late summer of 1940. The war was over, but the camp smelled like it hadn't heard the news. Damp canvas, boiled rice, disinfectant, the daily perfume of defeat. Rows of Japanese women stood barefoot on crushed coral, eyes fixed on a wooden platform where an American officer cleared his throat. The translator stumbled over the words, then repeated them, slower this time. All female internees will wear see-through blouses, effective tomorrow. For a moment, the wind stopped. A mosquito buzzed between them. One woman laughed too sharply, too fast, then covered her mouth. Orders in war camps were common, but this one, it didn't fit the pattern of rations or roll calls. It was an instruction written not on paper, but on pride. By mid-1945, over 4,000 Japanese civilians had been interned across Allied zones in the Pacific, about 600 of them women. Most were nurses, clerks, or widows who'd fled the firebomb. Now, they were prisoners of peace, stripped not by violence, but by policy. Private Harris, who had lost 2 brothers at Iwo Jima, whispered to another guard, "See through." "What the hell for?" His sergeant shrugged. "Morale experiment, command says. Keeps them compliant." No one asked which command. The women returned to their barracks silently. One of them, a former teacher named Sato, muttered under her breath, "We lost the war, but must we lose our skin too?" Her voice cracked like thin glass. That night, under a single bulb, buzzing with moths, sewing kits appeared. Old mosquito nets, ripped parachute liners, hospital gauze, anything translucent enough to follow orders, yet thick enough to hide shame. The air turned heavy with quiet rebellion. From his tent, an American sergeant watched through the slit in his canvas flap. The women's silhouettes moved like ghosts behind lantern light. The order had seemed like a joke hours ago. Now, it felt like a stain. Outside, rain began tapping the tin roofs. Inside, hands stitched defiance, one trembling thread at a time. The rule was clear, but so was the humiliation it carried. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the camp, it would glint off fabric that revealed everything except dignity. And one man among them would start to wonder who the real prisoner was. Morning broke thick and sticky, the kind of Okinawa heat that made metal groan and breath taste like salt. The women stepped out of their barracks in the new uniforms hand-stitched from mosquito nets and parachute silk. Pale ghosts shimmering in the sunlight. The fabric clung to their backs, turning transparent with each drop of sweat. They had obeyed the order, but the order had already stripped them before they moved. Private Harris couldn't look straight at them. He turned away, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the mud. Beside him, another guard muttered, "They didn't touch us, but their eyes did." It was meant as a joke, but the laughter died in the air. Even the guards sensed something wrong, like the rules had crossed a line invisible, but human. The Japanese women lined up silently. Among them stood Iko, a nurse from Nagasaki, who had survived the August blast, and then this humiliation, disguised as discipline. Her blouse stuck to her chest as she saluted weakly. When an officer barked, "Stand straight," she did. Trembling. Humidity averaged 84% here, enough to make any cloth see-through once soaked. Within minutes, every woman looked as if she'd been caught in the rain naked. Sweat glistened like oil on their arms. Their breaths came shallow. Shame had weight. From the tower, Sergeant Miller watched with unease. He'd written home about rebuilding order, but the scene below him felt nothing like order. It felt like decay. He thought of the Red Cross nurses back in Kansas, starched uniforms, clean respect. Here the same women who once treated soldiers now stood as exhibits. That night, a few tried to layer extra cloth, but guards made them remove it. The rule was enforced, even mocked. One corporal pointed and said, "Morale looks better already." No one laughed. Aiko clenched her fists until her nails drew blood. Miller couldn't sleep. He kept hearing fabric tearing, the faint rasp of needle through mesh. His conscience itched worse than the tropical insects. War was supposed to end with surrender, not with humiliation. Yet somehow, both sides were still losing pieces of themselves. Outside, lightning cracked over the horizon, reflecting off the thin fabric like camera flashes. Miller decided he couldn't just watch. The next day, he'd act even if it meant breaking his own orders. Night in Okinawa came slow, like the world itself was reluctant to rest. Inside his Quonset hut, Sergeant Miller sat under a swinging bulb, his face half-shadowed, the ink on his logbook smudged with sweat. Outside, cicadas screamed through the damp air, drowning out the quiet thud of his conscience. He had followed orders all war long, but now, the order followed him like a ghost, sitting just behind his shoulder. He flipped through pages of his log, fuel counts, rations, guard rotations. Then one blank line stared back. Waiting, he wrote, issued see-through blouses. Morale, undefined. His pen hesitated. That word undefined was safer than inhumane. He crossed it out, wrote it again, and underlined it twice. Earlier that day, he'd watched Aiko and the others standing in formation, sunlight slicing through the mesh like knives of shame. It burned into him worse than any jungle fever. He could still hear her voice cracking as she answered, "Roll call." Still see her eyes fixed, not on the officer but the dirt. Reports later showed that roughly 1 in 4 German POW camps across the Pacific drafted their own behavioral rules, without headquarters approval. Most were harmless. Some weren't. Miller knew this wasn't regulation, it was humiliation, disguised as authority. He lit a cigarette, watched the ember flare, then muttered, "What are we doing?" His roommate, Corporal Dean, didn't look up from his cot. "Orders are orders, Sarge." Miller's laugh came bitter, low. "Yeah, so were Nuremberg's." The air froze. No one spoke after that. Sleep refused him. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his pack, the one his sister had given him before he shipped out. Between family letters and grocery lists, he started sketching a plan. Extra cloth was stacked in the supply depot. U.S. parachute silk, standard issue, enough for him to make a quiet difference. At dawn, Miller stood outside the depot, cigarette burning low, staring at crates marked airborne, property of U.S. Army. His hand trembled as he broke the seal. War had turned theft into mercy. He didn't know it yet, but that single act of stealing a fabric would unravel more than a few stitches. It would set off a chain that would test loyalty, shame, and the meaning of victory itself. Midnight. The camp was asleep except for the jungle cicadas screaming, palm fronds whispering in the wet dark. Inside Barracks 7, 3 women sat cross-legged on the floor, lit by a single lantern muffled under a tin cup. Their fingers moved fast, stitching silk panels Miller had slipped under their door earlier. The fabric was smooth, cool, almost glowing under their hands. For the first time since capture, they weren't sewing orders. They were sewing dignity. Aiko ran her fingers across the material, whispering, "American silk." The others laughed softly. One of them, Keiko, once a tailor in Yokohama, measured out rough cuts from the parachute's curve. "Each canopy has 32 panels," she murmured, "enough to cover 6 women." She didn't mean just clothing. She meant shame. She meant hope. Outside, the guard tower spotlight swept lazily across the mud, missing them by inches each time. The sound of a distant generator coughed and sputtered. Inside, the sewing needles clicked like clock hands, counting down to discovery. Each stitch carried defiance. Every loop in the thread said, "We are still human." The blouses they made were thicker, opaque, slightly uneven, but that imperfection was its own badge of resistance. When one thread snapped, they tied a knot and whispered a prayer. For the ones who can't. Sergeant Miller, 2 huts away, couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, listening to the faint metallic rhythm of needles. He pictured them hunched in secret, faces half lit, the same light that once shone on his own sisters back in Kansas when they hemmed dresses for Sunday church. Except these women weren't sewing fashion. They were sewing rebellion under the nose of an empire. Before dawn, the women folded the new blouses neatly, hiding them under straw mats. They would wear them tomorrow, under the see-through ones. The rule would be a bait, technically, but their shame would not. As the lantern burned out, Keiko whispered, "For the first time since surrender, we stitched our dignity." No one replied. The silence felt like a promise held together by thread, but just as they drifted toward uneasy sleep, the distant echo of boots thudded across the compound. A voice shouted, sharp, angry. Someone had noticed something missing from the depot. The parachute silk wasn't as invisible as they'd hoped. Dawn came fast and cruel. The camp woke to the sound of boots, orders, and the metallic clatter of rifles. Word had spread before the sun even cleared the palms missing parachute silk. The phrase alone was enough to ignite chaos. Guards stormed through barracks, overturning straw mats, dumping tin bowls, shouting names none of the prisoners dared answer. Inside Barrack 7, the women froze. Isio's heart hammered so loud she thought it might give them away. The silk blouses lay hidden under the caught 3 pieces of forbidden cloth that glowed faintly in the morning light. Keiko's hands shook as she whispered, "Don't move." But when the first guard kicked open the door, the fragile stillness shattered. "Inspection," barked the lieutenant. 2 soldiers began tearing through their belongings, scattering what little they had, Combs' old letters, a doll made of twine. Then came the sound everyone feared, the soft flop of fabric hitting the floor. One silk blouse lay open, caught in the sunlight like a flag of guilt. Outside, Sergeant Miller watched from the edge of the compound. He knew that color, that sheen. His stomach dropped. He'd caused this. The women were dragged into the yard, lined up in front of the others. Faces blank, eyes forward. The silk blouses fluttered on the dirt beside them like captured secrets. "Who took army property?" demanded the lieutenant. Silence. Then another slap. Silence again. Reports later listed 2 soldiers disciplined for supply negligence. But the women, the ones who'd actually touched the silk, were ordered back into the see-through blouses. Sweat glued the fabric to their skin again. The punishment wasn't physical, but it cut deeper. Miller stood stiff as the lieutenant announced, "Discipline restored." He wanted to shout that it wasn't discipline, it was disgrace, but his tongue stayed still, trapped between duty and decency. That night, rain poured over the camp. The water streamed down the women's faces, washing away sweat, blood, maybe even regret. Iko looked up into the storm and whispered, "They punish shame with more shame." Miller returned to his hut, soaked, burning with guilt. He pulled out his notebook again, wrote only 3 words. "This ends tomorrow." His mind was set. He'd break the chain the only way he knew, through paper, not bullets. Rain hammered the tin roof like machine gun fire. Sergeant Miller sat at his desk, sleeves rolled, jaw tight, typewriter rattling under his fingers. Each keystroke felt like a confession. He wasn't writing a report this time, he was writing a protest. A direct letter to command in Manila. Subject: unethical conduct regarding treatment of Japanese civilian POWs. Immediate review requested. He hit the keys hard enough to dent the ribbon. He didn't soften the words. He described the see-through uniforms, the humiliation, the absurdity of an army that claimed to liberate, but instead stripped dignity. "This is not victory," he typed. "This is rot." Outside, the camp was quiet. The women slept in soaked blouses, the silk confiscated, their rebellion drowned under bureaucracy. Inside, Miller folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and scrawled, "To Allied Command, Manila HQ." He slipped it to Corporal Dean on mail duty, saying only, "Priority. Don't let it sit." Dean nodded. He meant it. But war mail was a ghost trail. Later records would show that over 17% of all correspondence between occupied Japan and Manila during 1945 simply vanished, misdelivered, or quietly destroyed. Miller's letter was one of them. The camp censor intercepted it the same afternoon. He read it twice, jaw clenched, then fed it into the small burn barrel behind his office. The flame hissed as the edges curled black. Miller's words turned to ash before they ever left Okinawa. That evening, Miller waited by the dock for the courier plane, hoping to see Dean load the sack. When it didn't happen, his stomach turned cold. He knew he didn't need proof. Silence was proof enough. In Barracks 7, Aiko noticed him pacing by the wire fence. She whispered to Keiko, "He's trying." But they both knew trying didn't survive long in camps like these. When Miller returned to his hut, the typewriter sat there, still warm. He stared at it like a dead comrade. "Even decency is contraband," he muttered. He tore a page from his notebook and began again, this time by hand. Outside, the rain finally stopped, but the smoke from the burn barrel drifted over the camp, faint and bitter. It smelled like lost words. The camp woke to rumors before sunrise. Inspectors coming. Red Cross. For the first time in weeks, the guards cleaned their rifles. The cook added a handful of rice to each pot, and the women were told to stand taller, smile wider, and speak English if they could. The order board read, "Be cooperative. Be grateful." Gratitude had become another uniform. By mid-morning, a small convoy of jeeps rolled through the gates. The Red Cross delegation, 3 men in khaki shirts. 1 woman with a clipboard stepped out, blinking at the glare. Cameras clicked. Every lens turned the camp into a display case of humanitarian oversight. The women were lined up again, the same translucent blouses clinging to their skin. The fabric shimmered like glass beneath the tropical sun. Aiko rehearsed her lines in her head. "We are fine. We are fed." She whispered it again and again. When the inspector stopped in front of her, she looked up, hoping he'd notice the blouse. The way it revealed more than it covered. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded politely and moved on. Nothing written, nothing said. The International Committee of the Red Cross would later file reports stating adequate clothing, adequate rations, and humane conduct. Adequate, a word that hid more than it revealed. Adequate meant survival, not dignity. Behind the inspectors, Sergeant Miller stood stiff as a fence post, jaw clenched. He had prayed that someone, anyone, would see through the charade. But all he saw was politeness polished into blindness. The visiting nurse smiled for a photo beside a group of prisoners. Aiko stood among them, blouse nearly transparent, eyes burning through the lens. When the convoy finally left, the camp exhaled a collective sigh of exhaustion and defeat. The women returned to their huts in silence. Keiko whispered, "He looked right through us." Literally. Aiko didn't answer. She just pressed her palm against the thin fabric on her chest, feeling her own heartbeat. Proof that she still existed. That night, Miller sat alone, sketching the inspection scene in his notebook, shading the outlines of figures fading into light. He didn't know it yet, but one of those photographs, snapped casually, meant to prove order would soon escape censor's hands and reach a world unready for its reflection. Weeks later, halfway across the Pacific, a single envelope slipped through the cracks of censorship. Inside, one glossy photo, stamped for record only. It showed a line of Japanese women, prisoners, faces blank, clothes translucent, sun burning through fabric. It was never meant for the public eye, but war has a way of leaking its shame. In San Francisco, a young journalist named Walter Keene, fresh from covering returning GIs, spotted the image in a shipment of routine military press materials. He froze. The caption read, "Civilians, under Allied Okinawa, 1945. Care." That word hit him like a slap. He saw the outlines of ribs, the visible shoulders, the hollow dignity standing in formation. He brought it to his editor. "Victory's shame," The headline draft read, "For one night." It sat ready for print. The presses even warmed up. But at dawn, a call came from a military liaison's office. Quiet, firm, final. Pull it. Within hours, the negatives were seized, the copies destroyed. Only 200 prints escaped before recall, scattered through the postal system like ghosts. Some burned, some buried, some framed in secret. But just one made it further. It was folded into a parcel bound for Tokyo, mixed with care packages for repatriated civilians. Reports from 1946 note the photo's quiet reappearance in a small Tokyo leftist newspaper. The headline, translated roughly, read, "The war didn't end for everyone." Beneath it, Isio's face stared out unintended, unrecognizable, but real. When Sergeant Miller heard about it months later, through a censored American bulletin, he felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The truth, even burned once, had found a way to breathe. Yet, in the same bulletin, a senior officer called the photo propaganda manipulation. History was already rehearsing its defense. For the women in Okinawa, nothing changed immediately, but the guards grew quieter, less certain. The laughter, the mockery at all, thinned like smoke. They had been turned into a photograph, but in doing so, they became undeniable. Aiko didn't know her image had crossed an ocean. She just noticed the guards stop meeting her eyes. Victory had lost its grin, and somewhere in a newsroom far away, shame had found its front page. Tokyo, 1947. The city still smelled of ash and rebuilding, a patchwork of tin roofs, half bricks, and stubborn hope. In a narrow alley of Kanda district, activists gathered around a bulletin board pasted with faded news clippings. At the center, tacked crookedly, was that photo. The one that had crossed an ocean, slipped past censors, and now stared back at the country that birthed the women it exposed. The room was silent, except for the buzz of a weak light bulb. Former students, nurses, even widows, leaned in close, their faces pale against the print. Isio's image, anonymous, yet undeniable, stood at the center of it all. Someone whispered, "This was one of ours." By then, Japan's press was barely crawling under Allied supervision. To criticize occupation policy was dangerous, but the image spoke louder than editorials. Within days, whispers spread through women's groups and university circles. "Did you see the blouses?" became a question traded like contraband. At a small civic hall, a former POW named Keiko stood up to testify. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "They called it order," she said softly. "We called it exposure." Reporters took notes nervously. None knew if the story would ever print. Diet hearings that same year briefly referenced morale, mistreatment of female detainees. Once. Then the record stopped cold. The mention was struck from final transcripts, filed away under disciplinary review, never reopened. Bureaucracy buried what shame had revealed. In the crowd, an old man whispered to his son, "They say it's over. But look, this war still breathes." That line spread too, half rumor, half truth. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Sergeant Miller's name surfaced in a quiet U.S. military memo. Subject suspected of unauthorized reporting. He was discharged that autumn. No charges, no pension. The system didn't punish him. It erased him, yet his diary survived, sealed in a box marked personal effects, stored in a Kansas attic. It would stay there for decades, until a historian cracked it open. Finding the story that both nations had tried to forget, Japan moved on. Buildings rose. Streets filled with neon, but in quiet corners, that photo remained copied, folded, hidden in drawers. Proof that even in silence, rage remembers its shape. Kansas, 1979. Dust motes danced in the golden light of a quiet attic. A young historian, Ellen Graves, opened a weathered army footlocker marked with fading ink, SGTT Miller. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed shirt, She found a small leather-bound notebook. The pages smelled of mildew, ink, and regret. The handwriting was tight, urgent, alive. August, 1945. Okan issued see-through uniforms. The men laughed. I didn't. Page after page unraveled what official reports had erased: orders, shame, silence. And then, one sentence underlined twice. We made them wear shame. Ellen sat frozen. This wasn't just a diary. It was testimony. A human voice trapped between wars. Miller had written about the night he smuggled parachute silk, the letter he'd mailed and lost, the Red Cross visit, the photo that surfaced and vanished again. No bullet ever hit me, one line read, but this memory never missed. She flipped to the final entry. The ink was faint, the hands shaking. One blouse, one war too long. That was the last thing he ever wrote. No signature. Just silence after. Ellen spent weeks verifying every name and place. Reports matched. The photo existed. The censorship was documented. But of the 600 Japanese female POWs interned in Allied camps, only 3 were ever identified by name. The rest faces without stories remained, buried under the polite language of victory. When Ellen published her findings, the world barely blinked. A few academic journals cited her work. One radio show read a paragraph aloud. But the real audience was invisible: the descendants, the forgotten, the ones who still carried the echo of humiliation like an heirloom. In Okinawa, a retired nurse named Aiko Morias. That Aiko read the article through tears. She was 80 now, frail but lucid. Her hand shook as she whispered, "Finally, he remembered us." Outside her window, the same ocean that once separated enemies shimmered in late sunlight. It didn't care who had won. It only reflected war ends and treaties, but dignity has no surrender date. The fabric rots, the photos fade, but memory keeps its shape.